What happens when the president of a nation stops his motorcade for a forgotten woman in the street? When Ibrahy Trari saw a frail figure clutching a weathered notebook, he had no idea he was about to meet the person who once changed his life, the teacher who taught him how to read. But what followed wasn't just a reunion. It became a movement. This isn't fiction. This is real. And it might be the most heartwarming undercover story you'll see this year. Stay until the end, because sometimes the most powerful classroom isn't where power is taught, but where compassion is remembered. The morning sun barely pierced the thick, dusty clouds that hovered over Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. The streets of the Sanan district, an impoverished quarter on the city's edge, were quiet, but far from lifeless. A haze of red dust lingered in the air, kicked up by wandering goats and barefoot children darting through narrow alleyways. Near a crumbling brick wall mottled with old campaign posters sat an elderly woman named Madame Mariam. Her back leaned heavily against the rough stone, her breath shallow but steady. At 68, her wiry gray hair escaped the edges of a frayed headscarf. Her clothes, a once white t-shirt now threadbare, clung to her fragile frame. In her lap rested a tattered notebook, its cover faded, its pages yellowed and curled with time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held it, caressing the worn edges like one would a sacred relic. Despite her appearance, her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the fragile light of memory. This notebook was all she had left, and inside, it lived the name of a boy she once believed in. Just a few streets away, a convoy of military vehicles moved cautiously through Sanan. At its center was a jeep carrying Ibrahy Trari, the nation's interim president. Known for his hands-on leadership and refusal to isolate himself behind walls, he insisted on seeing the city with his own eyes, much to the dismay of his security detail. As they rolled past the alleyway, his gaze locked on the elderly figure. By the wall, something in the curve of her shoulders, in the way she cradled the notebook, unmistakably familiar. He leaned forward. "Stop the jeep," he said sharply. The brakes squeaked, and so began the most unexpected chapter in both their lives. The jeep eased to a stop, its engine rumbling quietly as dust swirled in the air. Ibrahy Trari stepped out, the soles of his polished boots landing on the cracked pavement with a muted thud. He adjusted his olive-green military jacket and motioned for the soldiers to stay back. He approached slowly, eyes fixed on the woman still seated against the wall. With every step, a strange weight pressed heavier on his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Her posture, the way she clutched the notebook, it struck something buried deep in memory. When he stood just a few feet away, he spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "Madame, Mariam?" The woman blinked and looked up, startled. Her eyes, dulled by age but still piercing, searched his face. For a long second, she said nothing. Then, with a gasp that caught in her throat, she whispered, "Ibrahy? Ibrahy Trari?" Emotion rushed over him like a tidal wave. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "It's me." Mariam tried to rise, her body trembling under the effort. Her knees buckled, but Trari reached out quickly, steadying her gently. Her hands grasped his arm with surprising strength. She looked up at him, eyes wide and wet. "You were just a boy, always asking questions, always writing." She opened the notebook, revealing a page with faded, crooked handwriting. "I kept this," she said, "since you were 8. There it was, his name, scrawled in childish script across the top of a page filled with early letters and numbers. "Always knew you would be someone," she whispered. Trari stared at the page, then at the woman who had once taught him his first words. His throat tightened. The alley seemed to fall silent. For the first time in years, he felt like a student. Again. The silence lingered, thick and almost sacred, until Mariam lowered her eyes and sighed. She looked away as if ashamed of the image she now presented. Wrinkled skin, soiled clothes, and a body grown fragile with time and hardship. "I never imagined we'd meet again," she said quietly. "And certainly not like this." Trari's voice softened. What happened to you, madam? You were the strongest person I knew. Mariam nodded faintly, folding the notebook gently in her lap, like something holy. After I retired, my husband passed within the year. My children, they left for Europe. Promised to send money, promised to write. She paused, her mouth dry. I haven't heard from them in 3 years. She took a slow, shaky breath. With no pension, I couldn't keep my home. Debts caught up to me. The streets became my refuge and my prison. Traore looked around the alley. Bits of broken glass shimmered in the dirt. A tattered plastic bag clung to a branch. The scent of smoke and sewage hung in the air. You gave me words, he said, his voice cracking. You gave me power, and now… He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of guilt pressed on his chest like armor. Mariam reached for his hand. But look at you now. The little boy who stayed after class to ask questions. The one who couldn't pronounce independence? You made it. He shook his head slowly. I made it because of you. Their hands remained joined for a long, quiet moment. Then Traore stood, fists clenched, his voice firm. You will not sleep here another night, not while I lead this nation. For the first time, Mariam's lips curled into a trembling smile. But her pride hadn't died. I don't want pity, she whispered. You won't get pity, he said. You'll get what you've earned. President Traore straightened his back, turning sharply to the officer trailing him. Captain Sawadogo, he said with quiet urgency. Bring food, water, now. The young captain saluted and rushed to the vehicle as Traore crouched beside Mariam again. His voice was gentle but resolute. You're coming with me, madam, not as a charity case, not as a gesture, but because this nation owes you a debt. Mariam shook her head weakly. Ibrahim, I can't. Look at me. I'm filthy. I've got nothing. He reached for her shoulder and held it firmly. You gave me everything when I had nothing. You showed me I mattered. That's not something I forget. Captain Sawadogo returned moments later with a bottle of water and a bag containing flatbread and grilled peanuts. Traore took them and gently passed them to Mariam, who hesitated before accepting. Her fingers trembled as she sipped, the water spilling slightly down her chin. I'll have a doctor. See you, he continued. Clean clothes, a hot meal, then we'll talk about what comes next. Mariam's eyes, worn from years of struggle, searched his face again, as if trying to confirm he was real. You turned out good, Ibrahim, she whispered. Not just important, good. He smiled faintly. You told me once to be both, as she finished the bread slowly, savoring every bite like a feast. He stood and offered his arm. I want you to stand with dignity, not lean against a wall. With effort, she stood. Traore supported her, steady and patient. Then, notebook safely tucked into his jacket pocket, he guided her toward the waiting jeep. A few bystanders had gathered, whispering as the president of the nation helped an old woman into his car. He didn't care. In his heart, it was the most important thing he had done all year. The military jeep rumbled through the gates of the base on the edge of Ouagadougou. Soldiers straightened as they saw their president approach, but confusion flickered across their faces when they noticed the elderly woman by his side. No one asked questions. They simply stepped aside. Inside the base, a small guest room was hastily prepared. A clean mattress, white linens, a basin of warm water, and a borrowed cotton tunic folded neatly on a wooden chair. Mariam was helped inside gently, her eyes wide, adjusting to the quiet and the absence of dust and noise. I'll leave you to rest, Traore said softly, gesturing for a nurse to stay with her. You're safe here. She nodded silently, the shock of comfort almost overwhelming. Meanwhile, in the base's modest cafeteria, a cook was called to prepare a warm meal, rice with peanut sauce, a soft bread roll, and hibiscus tea. When it was brought to Mariam, she sat upright on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she touched the plate. The first bite made her pause. Tears welled in her eyes. I haven't tasted hot food in… I can't remember, she whispered. To the nurse, President Traore stood outside the room, speaking quietly with the base physician. She's severely malnourished, the doctor said, but it's not too late. With rest, food, and care, she can recover. Trari nodded. She won't sleep on the street again, not while I'm in office. He walked back to the room. Just as Mariam finished her tea, her shoulders less hunched, her hands steadier. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we begin again." Mariam smiled faintly, and for the first time in years she didn't feel like a burden. She felt like someone who mattered. The following morning, as light spilled over the dusty rooftops of Ouagadougou, President Trari sat alone in the command room of the base. In front of him lay the weathered notebook Mariam had clutched, its cover creased, its pages yellowed but intact. He flipped through them slowly. Crooked letters, simple math problems, classroom sketches. Every page held echoes of a little boy dreaming of something bigger. That boy had become a leader. But without this notebook, without the woman who gave it meaning, that journey might have never begun. Captain Ouagadougou entered quietly. "She's awake, stronger today. The doctor says her vitals have improved overnight." Trari nodded. "Good, but this isn't enough." He stood and tapped the notebook. "She gave me everything. Now it's time I give her more than just safety." He began issuing instructions. A modest house to be built within a secure community. Basic furniture, electricity, access to a nearby clinic, but most importantly, purpose. "She's a teacher," he told Ouagadougou. "She can teach. Again, even if it's just 10 children. She still has something to give." Ouagadougou looked unsure. "She's old, frail. She has a mind sharper than most," Trari replied firmly. "And a heart that built this country's future. We will restore her dignity, not just with walls, but with meaning." He took the notebook, slipped it into his coat pocket, and turned toward the corridor. "Come," he said. "Let's tell her what comes next." As the two men walked toward Mariam's room, Trari felt something shift within him. This wasn't just personal, it was national. In saving her, he was honoring the foundation of every child's dream, the teacher who first believed in them. A week later, under the soft morning light, a small community classroom buzzed with quiet energy. The room had been freshly painted with pale yellow walls, sunlight streaming through open windows, where curtains swayed gently in the breeze. 2 wooden desks had been arranged in rows, and behind them sat children, wide-eyed, curious, and a little nervous. Mariam stood at the front of the room. She wore a simple blue tunic, her gray hair neatly braided, her hands still thin but steadier than before. In her grasp was a piece of chalk. On the blackboard, she slowly wrote a single word. "Hope." The children repeated it softly, their voices unsure but eager. President Trari stood just outside the doorway, watching silently. His arms were crossed, but his eyes betrayed deep emotion. A week ago, this woman had been cradling a notebook in the street. Now she was giving children something he knew could change their lives, just as she had once changed his. Mariam turned to the class, a small smile forming. "This is where your future begins," she said gently. One child raised their hand. "Are you the president's teacher?" She laughed softly. "I was, but today I am yours." Trari stepped away quietly, the old notebook still in his jacket. He didn't need to interrupt. She was home, and the blackboard had never looked more powerful. News of Mariam's return to the classroom spread like sunlight over a dark field. Within days, the community buzzed with curiosity. Neighbors peeked through the windows, and passers-by lingered outside the schoolyard fence. At the local market, vendors spoke in awe. She was his teacher, the president's, and now she's teaching again. Radio stations picked up the story. Journalists arrived, drawn not by politics but by something purer: hope. Photos of Mariam writing on the chalkboard, surrounded by attentive children, appeared in newspapers across the country. "The teacher of the president," headlines read. Enrollment grew. The class of 10 soon became 15, then 20. Local parents brought children who had never set foot in a classroom before. A second room was opened. Volunteers from the base arrived to help with repairs and supplies. Some called it a miracle. Traore called it a beginning. One morning, he returned to the school. As he entered the courtyard, children erupted in cheers. Mariam met him at the door, her face glowing with health and something deeper, purpose. "You've started something I never imagined," she said, tears glistening. "They look at me like I'm a lighthouse." He smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are, for them, for me, for this nation." She turned to the students. "Today we learn about possibility," she announced. And in a small, painted classroom in Ouagadougou, the future of Burkina Faso took its next bold step forward, led by a woman who had once been forgotten and a boy who had never forgotten her. She once gave him a future. Today, he gave her back her purpose. In a world where power often forgets its roots, this story reminds us, the most powerful leaders never forget the hands that shaped them. From a dusty street to a thriving classroom, Mariam's journey is more than redemption. It's a blueprint of hope. If this story touched you, share it. Because out there, another teacher might be waiting to be seen, and another child might be one lesson away from changing a nation. Comment below how this story made you feel. Share it with someone who still believes in the power of gratitude. And remember, sometimes the smallest notebooks carry the biggest legacies.